So you started back in the early to mid 90s, right? Like 93 or something like that?
Yeah, that's probably, that 93 is probably when my first credits came in. I started doing it in 92, a bunch of free things that I screwed up. Royal.
How did then, I hate to say back then because that makes us sound like old.
I'm of a certain age.
But back then there wasn't like audio school in the sense that we have it now, where like when I went to school for audio engineering. It was, that was the fall of 97, and there were very few schools that offered it as like, you're going to go to school to be a studio engineer and you're going to learn consoles. So how did you deal with that?
Well, I married into New York City and didn't want to continue doing what I was then doing, which was being a paralegal for high-end real estate deals. Because I was changing states. It meant I would have had to learn a whole new state law, learn how to schmooze the courthouse clerks, the bureaucrats, God love them, and all that. And I'm like, oh God, wow, I can't do that. Plus, I learned there was only 1% of the lawyers that I could stomach, and that 1% I really like. But so I'm like, okay, I got to make a change, and in the interim, I had been doing a lot of poetry films and performance stuff. My ex-husband and I were poets together, among other things. And I'm like, okay. I realized, having made several poetry films, that I didn't know the lexicon. So I went, I was still a paralegal when I hit New York, but it was for an art book publishing house. And so I didn't have to relearn. I was learning new law as opposed to relearning an old law that I already knew, which would have been stupid. If I'm going to expend energy, I might as well learn something new. So I'm doing copyrights and permissions for art images. And I started taking classes at NYU. They had had night classes in filmmaking. And I'm thinking my poetry films will improve quite a bit. And then the art book publishing world, the economy took a dump in 92. And the woman for whom I worked, who was the CFO, had been hired to fix what was wrong with the company not making enough money. And her first, after a year of being there, she says, okay, 2/3 of the staff are fired, including you.
Ooh.
Oh, well, all right. Reagan's in office, and they kept extending unemployment, which allowed me to make a change. And what I learned, to having taken night classes at NYU for filmmaking, that everybody wanted to be a director or the camera person, lighting technician, the DP. Nobody wanted to do sound. I'm like, well, I had done sound, and that's a whole other long story. But so now I've got unemployment that keeps getting extended, and I learned that NYU has an intensive film course that was 12 or 13 weeks. That was essentially like being on a film in terms of its hours, 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 or 10 at night.
Wow.
Days. And we did a bunch of little movies for that. There were 50, I think, in the class. And once again, I was the only person out of the 50 who wanted to do sound. And I really got a kick out of it. I did a lot of it since I was the only one interested, worked on everybody's projects. And I'm like, wow, I could do this. And the thing did help me learn to make better poetry films. I had some success with them, if that isn't an oxymoron, a successful poetry film. But then I'm like, wait, I really like this, and I could make a living. So I started making phone calls, got a job in the repair shop of a sound rental house in New York by the name of Erskine Shapiro, whose rental gigs included the Olympics.
Wow.
And the 4th of July sound system for the fireworks in New York City. And so I was checking things in, repairing them, checking them out, which got me well versed in soldering and troubleshooting. Kept making phone calls because I really didn't want to do that. And got in touch with a fellow by the name of Joel Holland. Said, well, why don't you come tomorrow for a set? So I showed up beginning of season 2 of Law and Order. And because they gave me an invitation at the end of every day in the form of a call sheet, I just kept coming back. 4 months. Nobody said not to.
Were you getting paid for that, or was it just kind of basically like an apprenticeship almost?
Well, it was not discussed. I didn't talk with the mixer, who was Bill Daly, until after I had, in the meantime, I'm still going down to NYU and looking at the bulletin boards, because that was pre-internet, to see who was shooting. And so I was getting little gigs. So I finally had to leave there because I got a gig, and Bill lent me some Shep's mics and sound blankets, and I rented the big alternating current plugged in mixer from a house in New York that had reputedly been the mixer used by the guy who did whatever that Miami Vice. And that just gave me a thrill to touch the faders that it. But
wow. Was it really the mixer on Miami Vice?
I don't know. In the guys that rented it to me, that's what they told me. And by God, I was naive. I believed everything.
But so you were going to Law and Order. You were showing up there. What were you doing there? Were you just like hanging out, or?
I stayed the fuck out of the way. I kept
Yeah.
against the wall. I wasn't asking questions. Man, I didn't even know how to be on a set. I didn't know enough to ask a good question, so I didn't bother. I just like, well, I'm not just, and the guys would, Law and Order, their MO was they didn't have catered lunches. They would get an hour off, hour and 15 for lunch. So oftentimes they'd give me money and I'd go pick up Chinese food and bring it back, where they'd eat real quick and then nap. So there weren't lunch conversations.
Wow.
And
so you just observed, pretty much, just watched.
And they, after a certain amount of time, the shop stewards said, well, you can wrap some cables if you want, or lay a carpet, or put up a sound blanket. They wouldn't bitch. This was a NABIT show, not IATSE, because that was pre-NABIT IATSE merger. So they were a little bit less tight than the IATSE group. But, I was thrilled to go inventory the truck. I got to go through every case, every thing, and learned how he put stuff together. And then when they had a 2-week hiatus, they brought the gear back and we took everything apart. I cleaned the mixer, made some improvements on the mixer. I'm like, you don't have a windscreen on that thing. So I put a windscreen on the off-back mic on the Fila mixer. And Bill Daly was, unbeknownst to me at the time, was one of the early adopters of radio mics. Moreover, his background was in the Navy. An RF guy on a nuclear sub, so he knew his shit.
Jeez.
They were bouncing signals off the ionosphere, and so, yeah. I got to watch a lot of stuff happening.